Welcome, everyone, and good morning to the Center for Global Development. I'm Amanda Glassman, the Executive Vice President and a Senior Fellow here. We were really pleased to host on October 6th U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who called for an evolution of the development finance system to meet a triple imperative that all of you have been talking about all this week, dealing with the immediate crises associated with cost of living shocks and growing debt burdens, continuing to address countries' development needs, including persistent poverty and inequality, supporting country-led plans, and of course, the new global challenges, scaling up, well, not really that new, to be honest, but getting more effective on climate, biodiversity, pandemic risks, and other global challenges in ways that are both just and equitable. Secretary Yellen's words echoed calls made by Germany, Norway, and experts like Tharman Shanmugaratnam and Larry Summers this time last year at CGD, that the World Bank needed an updated mandate, a business model that better reflects cross-border and global challenges, and that the MDBs needed to operate as a system more collaboratively with the large-scale concessional resources that are needed, but that also exist elsewhere in the system. And that all of this required additional resources, including stretching the balance sheet and likely a capital increase. These new directions generate questions from shareholders who are more than usually engaged given the polycrisis. How exactly will these ideas land operationally within the bank and the rest of the MDB system? What do they mean for the allocation of scarce concessional finance between funds to address low-income country priorities like IDA and the global challenges? Are there trade-offs between these mandates that we need to address? How does the global agenda fit inside or outside the country engagement model? And then proposed reforms would also change some of the tenets of the World Bank's operation that have been on the table for a long time, like the idea of IBRD graduation, for example, given that middle-income countries and their private sectors are the places that emissions are concentrated. We have to work in middle-income countries if we want to address these kinds of global challenges. And what would make this whole effort feasible and serious, right? How can financing be structured to really make a measurable difference on the outcomes that matter? As this week ends, shareholders are calling on the World Bank Group to deliver a roadmap by the end of the year. So we're going to be asking some key shareholders, what can we expect? What will this process look like? We're fortunate to start off with a keynote from Minister Svenja Schulze. She's the Federal Minister of Economic Cooperation and Development from Germany. And then we'll follow with a panel conversation and a question and answer session with Alexia Latortue, who's the Assistant Secretary of International Trade and Development at the US Department of Treasury, Monica Medina, who's the Executive Director for the constituency of Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Paraguay, Peru, and Uruguay at the World Bank. We have Ed Mountfield here, Vice President of Operations, Policy, and Country Services at the World Bank. He was also part of our event a year ago, and Jürgen Sattler, who's the Director General at the BMZ. So over now to Minister Schulze, and we'll look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Amanda, colleagues, guests, ladies and gentlemen. I believe that there is a great momentum to shape the World Bank so it becomes fitter for tackling existing and future global challenges, and we should jointly seize the moment. This is a turning point of the global multilateral system and the multilateral development banks in particular. So when I say we, I mean all stakeholders, borrowing and non-borrowing alike. There might be different views grounded in well-justified political objectives, but I am very glad that all governors have given the World Bank the task of working on this, and I am determined to initiatives and support the dialogue. This morning we already had a frank discussion with other governors from all around the world and with the bank's senior management. These days, most of the world's biggest challenges are transnational, and they are threatening our societies and our economies. But it is important to note that social inequality, climate change, and biodiversity loss, pandemics, and conflicts disproportionately affect the world's poorest and most vulnerable groups more strongly. What these global challenges have in common is that no country can deal with them entirely by itself. And at the same time, they all need to be addressed in order to achieve and protect sustainable development in all countries. So our existing multilateral development of financial architecture was not designed to address this type of transnational challenges. There was a member in the morning, she said it was addressed for linear catastrophes, but now we have a lot of challenges at the same time. We see shocks every day. So, and determined action will be really crucial. With its global balance sheets and knowledge, the World Bank offers a decisive platform for collective action, which includes action for achieving the SDGs by 2030. If the World Bank is to achieve its goals of ending extreme poverty and boosting shared prosperity in a sustainable manner, its vision will have to take in account of the changing global landscape. We need an updated consensus that integrates the goals of poverty reduction, shared prosperity, achieving the sustainable development goals, and addressing global challenges. There isn't a trade-off between climate action, pandemic preparedness, and conflict prevention on the one hand, and education, social protection, and food security on the other. The achievement of these sustainable development goals will not be possible without protective action and preventive measures. And the reverse is true as well. It is only by fostering sustainable human development that we will manage, for example, to conserve biodiversity and prevent armed conflicts. The breakfast debate that we had this morning renewed my understanding of the worries and political deliberations and trade-off that many borrowing countries face. They are concerned that they may now have to borrow funds to address issues for which the global north is responsible. And they fear that they then might not have enough funds left for their own development objectives. So I take these concerns very seriously. We are committed to the principles of common but differentiated responsibilities. And that is why our task as shareholders and also the task of the bank is to keep making it very clear how closely the global challenges are interlinked with achieving the SDGs. The sustainable achievement of the SDGs will not be possible if we fail to protect and provide global public goods. And this will be even more apparent once we have the right methodologies and instruments to factor the loss of biodiversity and the cost of global pandemics in our analyses and strategies, like we have been doing for CO2. Only then will the borrowing countries also borrow funds to prevent these global public bets. And I want to raise the questions of whether we need to take a different approach for concessional lending, for instance, by including middle-income countries, which are, for example, crucially important for climate action. An idea which Secretary Yellen also addressed in her well-reviewed speech on how to reform the multilateral development banks 10 days ago. So the bank could, for example, advise on necessary climate-related reforms within the framework of development policy operation on concessional terms. We have been calling for this instrument to be scaled up massively for some time. There are many layers to such a reform of instruments and operational models, and we should not stop at just creating another trust fund, which almost seems to be an reflexive answer to new challenges. Of course, we cannot shy away from the question how to finance the solutions to global challenges. Particularly for climate mitigation and adaptation, we need more resources. And I am determined to lead by example. At COP27 in Egypt next month, Germany, together with G7 and V20 countries, will introduce a new approach to protect vulnerable people against the consequences of climate change in the form of the Global Shield against climate risks. Looking at measures beyond new donor funds, the G20 panel on capital adequacy had made important recommendations on how to better use the bank's balance sheet. How these recommendations can be applied to the bank needs thorough consideration and on proper process. In addition, we need to look at existing concessional resources and how we can make better use of them and address global challenges from either to the various climate funds and the existing Global Public Goods Fund. The next point is one that I have already mentioned, but it is especially important to me. In these multiple crises, we can again see that the poorest and the most vulnerable are hit the hardest. So that is why social protection is crucial and is the best kind of crisis prevention. So in areas such as energy transition and loss and damage from climate change, the point is to protect the most vulnerables. That means, for example, that middle-income countries will also need sufficient fiscal space and, where appropriate, more concessional funding. So, as I said in the beginning, so I like to close with that also, there is a momentum which we need to grasp. The bank should hold a structural dialogue on these topics with all stakeholders via the executive board, and then when we meet again in the spring meeting, we will have already taken a big step forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Minister. I'd like to invite our panelists up on the stage. Thank you, colleagues. That's good. Thank you. We made our team spend their Saturday with us, so thank you to all of them for being here with us. All right, well, we've heard the words of the minister, and I know that some of you were also there this morning at the breakfast of shareholders that the minister was referring to. So I would just invite you, and of course all of the things that we've heard from this week, starting with Secretary Yellen's remarks on the 6th. Maybe I could just ask you to reflect on what you've heard and what you think are the big take-home messages and next steps. And we'll start with Alexia and just go down our panel.
So thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to everyone who's here on a Saturday morning. We love our MDB system and we want to evolve it, so I like the commitment. Minister from Finance from Ghana said this morning, something is in the air. And I think that captures it well for me. There, as you said, many of the challenges are not new. I think Minister laid out the driver behind the evolution that many of us as shareholders want to see in the institutions. And I think what's in the air is, I would say, number one, a sense of political commitment that as shareholders, we need to pay more attention to these institutions and not in a, there's this crisis, come in and solve. There's that crisis, but actually moving away from a patchwork approach to really saying, let's take a step back to truly step up MDBs, to deliver on your poverty reduction mandate, to deliver on the SDG mandate, and to do much more to help countries facing these global challenges, climate being first and foremost, but I would say pandemics, fragility as well. What would it take to allow you to do that, MDBs? So that's sort of where we are, and I think the other takeaway for me that's really reassuring, and I think this is a really important point, emerging countries, we'll hear soon, so and if you disagree, obviously you'll say it, but the emerging market countries that I've spoken to have really quite embraced the way that we're talking about this evolution. because we're clear that it's about a refreshed vision for development that really integrates the fact that, you know what, unmitigated global challenges absolutely can reverse development gains and development aspirations and really threaten financial stability, threaten financial health, threaten the human well-being and health as well. And conversely, the lack of development, when a shock happens, well, then the vulnerabilities are magnified, right? And so I think emerging market countries have sort of seen this integrated vision for development as really reflecting their priorities and the link between national priorities and global challenges and how they interact. So I sense optimism, but I will also say that we have set high expectations this week. And failing to deliver on these high expectations will put us even in a worse position than we were in before this week. And so focus, purpose, perhaps avoiding distractions where there's disagreements, but really concentrating our efforts where there's alignment and agreement about what can make a difference in the short term, keeping an eye on the more tricky long-term issues as well, but really starting to make progress. By December, the minister said it, we asked for a roadmap from the World Bank, you said it, I think, from the World Bank, and really, step by step, putting the foundations for this evolution that's so important.
Okay, great. So we'll hope to hear soon who's in charge of that at the bank. Monica, you sit on the board. You've been grappling with these issues for some time. What's your perspective, and what are you hearing from your peers?
Okay, thank you, Amanda. First of all, thank you for the invitation and for all of you for being here today. We've been, and to go with this discussion about global challenges and the role of the MDBs. I've heard these days about the necessity of going further on looking ahead at the vision of the bank. But I think global challenges has been here, and we were at the center of our discussions because of the compounding crisis that they were facing since 2019, the COVID pandemic, the crisis, the climate change crisis, the war, the food and energy situation. And this had a big impact on human capital, on income distribution, and also especially in growth in emerging countries. So I agree that it's important to address these urgent challenges, global challenges, but at the same time, we need to go to look after our long-term goals. We can't forget about that. So in this case, if you ask me what are the things we have to look after is, first of all, the country engaged model. It's important that we keep looking at the national priorities and how to align the national priorities with the global challenges. Because, and it was, you had a survey the other day presented here by Odi, and it was very telling about this connection between what the countries want to finance and what the MDBs want to finance. I saw the survey on the screen, and I saw that the countries wanted to finance water and sanitation, health, and for the other side, the MDBs wanted to finance climate. Because so there's a disconnection between all the things that we want to finance and the things that the MDBs want to do. So there's a challenge here how to greening these opportunities and at the same time to continue to address poverty reduction, inequality reduction, and fulfill the sustainable growth. So I think there's a challenger for MD, for the bank. And also, as the minister mentioned about the middle income countries, I think they are key. And my colleagues that are here, and they can tell that I always talk about at the board about the role of the middle income countries and how important they are here, and especially to help tackle global challenges. And middle income countries were hit harder for the pandemic. We had a lot of human losses. We had a lot of reduction in growth. So here I think we are key elements here, and we need to keep working on this kind of groups. And at that point, it's important to look after that I say that, and you mentioned, Amanda, about the restrictions that were imposed in the 2018 capital increase from the bank, and about the financing from above and below GDI. And here it's a trade-off between the middle income countries that are just to graduate from that. So at that point, are we going to approach with the financing to these middle income countries, and because they are drivers for the development in the future. And I want to give you, and if you want to address global public good, it's important that the bank and the middle and the MDBs find a way to finance to help middle income countries. And I want to give you an example, if you allow me. In the last 25 years, and I don't want to mistake the numbers, 25 countries moved from leaks to becoming middle income countries. Now we have 24 countries being leaks. That it's an important achievement. And in the same period, 29 countries moved from middle income countries to high income countries. That's another big achievement. But we have still 80 countries that remained in the middle income countries for the last 25 years. So we have a challenge for the World Bank and all the MDBs. We have to work with them. They are trapped in that situation. So I think this is the important progress that MIC will have to help all the global agenda to go further. So that's why I was very vocal on saying that we need to address this kind of countries. And about the financial capacity of the bank, I agree. There are not enough resources right now, because we have the twin goals that the bank has to fulfill, but we have these other challenges, and we were asking for more things for the MDBs, especially at the bank, but we have the same resources. So we need to look after, on the private sector mobilization, domestic mobilization, but we need to find innovative instruments. For example, the other way is strengthening the bank balance sheet. But there are alternatives like grant-based windows for global challenges that could use for blend financing, or even the green capital increase that we were talking, that was put on the table lately, the last days. And finally, incentives matter. So for countries to ask for special conditions for loans and new instruments are important for addressing the global public goods. And other countries demand, we want countries to demand this kind of financing. But to demand in the scale we need, we have to give them incentives. We have to give special conditions. So I think the World Bank needs to provide all countries with appropriate financing. Concessional financing could be an option. Blend financing could be another one. But there are other kind of instruments. For example, the one that is low cost, the cost of borrowing, for example, with the compromise of getting climate action activities, or debt for climate swaps to reduce the debt from the country. So I think this is the kind of things we need to discuss, and we have to have in mind when we discuss all this situation.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks. You've really laid out a lot of the big issues that the middle-income countries that sit on the board and that our borrowing member countries are asking to the bank as they set out in this area. We'll come last to you, Jürgen. Jürgen has he's been many years involved in this discussion and was also part of the bank's governance during the creation of a global public goods window that does exist at the bank, but it's quite small. And it hasn't necessarily been used for all things climate, but for some other uses. Maybe we'll ask you to reflect on that and some of the ideas about should we have a bigger version of that? What does it look like? Is it a new window? Is it an IDA-like window? Okay, but first we'll go to you, Ed. You're on the spot here. Of course, you're not the president of the bank, but you can please feel free to say, how is this all going to happen, given what the shareholders have been saying this week?
Well, the World Bank, of course, is a cooperative of its members, its management, its shareholders, and I think a key thing I'm going to emphasize is that that we welcome this evolution. We need to evolve together. This is going to be a collective task. It's very clear that the world is in a dangerous place. Extreme poverty after decades of progress is on the rise again, as our Poverty Reduction and Shared Prosperity report issued in the last few days makes painfully clear. It's very clear that conflict and violence are rampant around the world. We see that every day. It's very clear that we are not winning the battle on climate change, either in terms of mitigation or adaptation, and our country climate and development reports that we're issuing on at a fast clip at the moment, many more to come, are making clear that these are huge challenges for countries. So I'm really encouraged by the discussions that we've had this week, the discussions, particularly at yesterday's Development Committee meeting. We heard the clearest statements from our shareholders yet on their willingness to work together and with each other and with management to frame a new shared vision for the World Bank. They agreed the need to look at the World Bank Group's ambition, its financial capacity, and find ways to bolster and scale up the response to the global challenges and the SDGs. And I think that there's never been a more important time for that. So 4 things are clear for me, I think, from the conversations that we've had. First, we all agree that the dichotomy sometimes suggested between development and climate action is a false one. It's clear that the road to the Paris goals and the road to the Sustainable Development Goals is the same road. Secondly, the dichotomy sometimes suggested between country-driven development and global goals is also a false one. It's clear that we need to help countries tailor development and climate action to national circumstances, and we need to build national ownership, otherwise we will fail. Third, we need significantly scaled up global financing and fair burden sharing between the rich and poor countries, the high consumers of carbon historically and today, and the low consumers of carbon, if we're to turn things around. Fourth, the World Bank Group, with its combination of financial capacity, knowledge, on-the-ground presence, private and public sector capability, needs to be at the center of this scaled-up global response, and we're not yet where we need to be. So I think that these are very exciting conversations. The World Bank Group's response since the start of the COVID crisis has not been trivial. We've provided over $250 billion since the start of the COVID crisis. Last fiscal year alone, we provided a record $115 billion. And nor have we been absent on climate. World Bank Group climate finance increased around 80% over the last 3 years to reach almost $32 billion this past fiscal year. So no one in the world provides more climate finance to developing countries than we do. But it's very clear that the MDBs and IFIs and the World Bank Group, first and foremost, need to do much, much more. So on the World Bank Group part, I think it's going to take effort to think differently and do things differently, and I'd be happy to return to that later in the conversation. But I want to just make the point that it's also going to require some evolution in our authorizing environment. I think I take the point that we need to evolve our mission, we need to evolve our financing model, our operating model, and I think we are committed to that. But I don't want to allow the conversation completely to focus on the need for internal reforms. I think we need to have a conversation about the level of our ambition. And with the capital adequacy framework work is I think, absolutely vital. We welcome it, and we're engaging to look at ways in which we can stretch our balance sheet further. Of course, we must always stretch our balance sheet as far as possible. But I think it's important that people remember that in the history of the World Bank, since 1947, only $20 billion of capital has been paid into the World Bank. And with that, we've been able to deliver over $800 billion of development finance and rising. Actually, almost $100 billion of that IBRD financing in the last 4 years. And on top of that, that $20 billion has generated net income that's become one of the major contributors to IDA and concessional financing. So we need to continue to push as far as we can on that, and there are some very interesting proposals in the capital adequacy framework. But the question of capital adequacy is one that we do need to come back to, and I think we need to be thinking about whether the measures in the capital adequacy framework are sufficient for the level of ambition that we have for the world. And I think that's a topic I'll be interested to hear more about, because some of our shareholders have been recently briefing that the measures in the capital adequacy framework package might contribute tens of billions of dollars to our lending capacity, not the hundreds of billions of dollars that the report proposes. So I imagine that's over a decade, and that's a few $1 billion of extra financing a year. Maybe it will be more than that, but we do need to ask ourselves what's the scale of our ambition. We also need a conversation about concessional financing and about who we lend to, and I'll be happy to turn back to these points later in the conversation.
Yeah, I think, the trend in concessional financing, when you look around just to talk about aid in general and what's happened to IDA over time, is not that encouraging. So if we really are going to have a bigger mandate in this space, what does this look like? And then we do have a lot of concessional finance in the system as well. How well does that work with the bank or not? So maybe we can come back to that as well. Jürgen, your thoughts on all of this?
Yeah, thanks a lot, Amanda. And you have mentioned the global public goods window, which is tiny. And why has it changed now? Or has it changed now? I think it has changed the situation, and for several reasons. And first, as has been said, now we are really at another place. In the meantime, for some reasons, we are confronted with crisis. And crises are linked with global challenges and global public goods. So we have seen 10 years ago the financial crisis, then the pandemic, then the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and it's here to stay. So I think now it's becoming more aware that we have a systematic problem. And the other point is there are some governments who, for some reason, the situation changed. In the US, the situation changed. Janet Yellen took it up. In Germany, the situation changed, and in other countries too. So it really resonates. That's my understanding, and that's what Alexei also said. There is some dynamic. Time is different now. And so what do we have to do? And for me, it's very much about a systematic approach. It's not that, there's a crisis, what shall we do? And we open a new trust fund. We need to have a systematic approach. And what does this mean? It means many things. The first one is what has been said. The bank has the key role to play there. It's a global bank, and we are talking about global challenges and global crises. And the bank has a country-based model, and that's a big strength. And nobody wants to put that in question. But it has to better reconcile this country-based model with these global challenges we are facing. There are many ways to do it, and we have suggested a few avenues, and we want to discuss that, and we already have started to discuss it. The second point, systematic, means that, the bank is very much working in terms of projects, sometimes isolated projects. The donors are also pursuing such an approach, but that's not enough. We have to go from projects to systematically help countries, for example, to adapt to the new climate reality. And therefore, it's not enough to support a renewable project here and there. We have to look at it. What do countries head for? How do they see their decarbonization path? What help do they need in terms of knowledge, in terms of analytics, in terms of investment, in terms of policy reform? This comprehensive view, and this is the World Bank who has to do that. We can't do it bilaterally, but we can help. So that's the second point. And the third point is we have to look at beyond the World Bank. And it has a lot to do, about with resource flows, with the debt crisis we are facing, and countries are really desperate. And we have to have this broader view and also see the World Bank as part of the international architecture, as part of a system working closely. You always, people always say there's a wonderful relationship with the IMF, but I think even a wonderful relationship can be improved. It's the IMF, it's the UN system, and so on. So we have discussed with some this issue. We have worked out a non-paper. These are ideas, and we are very, very happy that now the shareholders in the development committee, but also the bank is taking that up. And it's more the question now, I think somebody said, not if, it's more the question how, and this is very complicated, of course, and that's it.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about we have COP27 coming in November. We have protesters on the street again in front of the World Bank. And that means, because people are really associating progress on climate with the World Bank, which I think in a way is a very positive development, because what they're saying is you're the symbol of the world providing money to deal with these big global challenges. And so, but I suspect that those people will also be looking at COP in this sense. What will we have will we be promising something at COP for what comes for the next round in terms of the role that climate finance could play, sort of that broader public communication around what we'd like to see our global institutions do? Could you comment on that?
No, I'm happy to, and if I may, I'm going to try and weave in some threads from what I heard from my fellow panelists. So I think I want to start with what Monica said in terms of the ODI report, which I read very carefully too. And is there a disconnect between the demand from countries and the climate agenda? And I just want to strongly associate myself with what Ed said. Okay, it is a false debate to say climate and development are two different choices. Okay, I just strongly and infrastructure. We have to build so much infrastructure in emerging markets. That infrastructure better be low carbon infrastructure if it's going to be useful for these countries, right? So if you look at the sources of emissions, it comes from the power sector and other sectors. And so they're actually the same agenda. And I think one of the most important things I want us to remember from this panel is this point, because otherwise we're not going to make progress, right? So the infrastructure demand and the climate, for me, it's exactly the same thing. How we do it, how we finance it are the tricky questions, right? And so I think on the way to COP, it's not, and this is an implementation COP, the Egyptians say it themselves, but it's about the clarity of how do we finance different needs. So middle income countries, clear need for more concessionality. I think we need to let go of some dogmas and be open to that. But it's not the door wide open either. I think we have to look at the nature of the investment, understand the risk return profile, and where the risks are super high and the returns are not, we need to be able to include concessionality for middle income countries. So for example, to decommission a coal plant, that probably takes concessional finance. Renewables in most markets today does not as much, right? So I think we need to be in a world where in the same country, the World Bank may have different terms linked to the reality of what the investment needs are. So that's one point that I want to make. I think the other is to connect the dots between the financial capacity piece, which is one of the 4 areas of reform asked that we have, and what kind of financing we need. So we need scale, that's crystal clear. But we also need to be very clear about what kind of scale we want. If we're talking about more concessionality, some of the ways that we can get to scale actually increases the cost of borrowing. So for example, one idea that we support as the United States is issuing hybrid capital. Subordinated debt, it's more risky, it's more expensive. So it gets you scale, good, because you need scale for lots of purposes. But remember, for the concessionality, you don't get that, right? And so I think the debate has to be quite precise about what we're trying to achieve, the quality of financing to the purpose of the activity. I think we also, going to COP, we need to also understand in terms of how we think about eligibility for funding and perhaps introduce a new dimension. So we look at country income level, we look at access to markets, institutional strength. Maybe we need to introduce vulnerability in terms of allocation issues. And that's particularly true for the Caribbean, for the Pacific. So I think these are the specificities that are linked to implementation that can actually change the way we do business with real results for countries, as opposed to a bunch of new announceables is sort of the way we're thinking about it.
Okay. To get this done, I'm just trying to think about inside the bank. Do you imagine setting up a dedicated team to work on this with the shareholders? Or, see, I think we've had this discussion over the years, but it's been like one on a list of many things to do. What are you thinking?
So we got this request confirmed yesterday at the Development Committee, but I think absolutely we're going to deliver the roadmap by the end of the calendar year, and I think we'll see that as a launching pad for a process that will take a little bit longer, but we need to move quickly, and I think it will involve all of the senior leadership of the World Bank, and I think there'll be a team put together in the coming days to take that forward, but with obviously a very strong role for operations and finance teams, I think, working together, because the operations and the finance has to come together. I'd like to pick up just briefly on the point Alexia made about concessional finance, because I think that's a very important thing. One of the really important things in Janet Yellen's speech here last week, apart from the signaling of a desire for a bigger and more globally focused World Bank group, was the references to the idea of concessionality for middle-income countries to support and incentivize focus on global public goods. And this actually connects to Monica's point as well about, how do you make countries have incentive to invest in the climate emergency. So this issue of reconciling the country-driven development model and the and global issues that our shareholders give us money to advance is not really a new one. It's one that the World Bank has grappled with since its inception. Poverty reduction, which I always argue is also a global public good, is not something that every country wants to prioritize either. And so back in the era of Jim Wolfenson, we've devised mechanisms to incentivize focus on poverty reduction. And we've been very successful in, I think, advancing that agenda. I think we can do exactly the same. I think the new country climate and development reports are having a transformational impact on the World Bank Group and on the dialogue with our clients, and will be, I believe, the most powerful tool for shifting the focus, because it's about winning hearts and minds, persuading with evidence. We can think about moving our mission statement from green, resilient, inclusive development to some other way of wording it. We can think about organizational tinkerings, but I actually think it's really that's going to be the big driver, and making sure that follows through into our country partnership frameworks and the way that we work. But on the issue of concessional financing, yes, we need concessional financing, not just in the poorest countries, but we need concessional financing to incentivize in middle-income countries. But let's remember, and I think Alexia was alluding to this, concessionality is expensive. It loses money by construction and by definition, and it needs to be regularly replenished. So you mentioned the issue that cash contributions to IDA stagnated about a decade ago. We're enormously grateful for the hugely generous contributions from Germany and from the United States, and these countries have been leaders in advocating for an early IDA 20. They've been and they've stepped up their contributions. But looking at IDA contributions as a whole, they've stagnated, and we've been able to increase IDA commitment authority by using reflows, using aggressive leveraging, and by making major contributions to IDA from IBRD zone net income. but to make more concessionality available is going to be a challenge. So I agree, we need to target it, we need to prioritize it. I would, in my wildest dreams, wish we could have huge amounts of concessional financing, but I think the reality is that that's going to be hard for these guys and girls to get through their enabling environment, even though probably they would wish to do it in their hearts as well. So how do we target that concessionality? I think is a key issue. Private capital mobilization also, I think, a key agenda. But again, private capital mobilization in developing countries is not simple, and it requires investment upstream to lay the groundwork. To address the policy environments. I completely agree with Jürgen. We need to think about more climate-focused development policy financing, but it also requires blended finance, and that's going to take concessionality as well. So I think we do come back to the issue of where's our ambition and how can we get the resources to deliver on that ambition, even as we must work on clarifying our mandate, our mission, and our operating mechanisms.
Okay, sounds good. So I'm being told we have to go to audience Q&A, but I do want to come back to this issue of middle-income country demand. A colleague of mine, Charles Kenny, looked at the flows over time that countries were demanding from the bank, and it really is concentrated around the economic cycle. When countries are in trouble fiscally or they don't have access to the market, that's when they go to the banks. That makes total sense. We're really talking about trying to change that thinking. Some of the regional development banks look a bit different in terms of middle-income country demand. And so one question back to you, I'm going to collect some others, is what about the role of the regional development banks in this space? Would you see a division of labor? How do you think about that? So we'll come back to that. We'll collect 3 questions from the audience. If you raise your hand, we'll have someone come. Okay, our friend from the Pandemic Action Network. Say who you are, please, and your affiliation.
Hi, thanks, Amanda. Thanks for this panel. Carolyn Reynolds, co-founder of the Pandemic Action Network. So 2 quick questions. One is, I'm thrilled by this conversation. I worked at the bank for many years, so I know the bank very well. And this is an exciting direction of travel, and great to hear you say, Ed, in terms of how the management is looking at this. But a precise question for you is, it's been, 8, almost 10 years ago now, right? The bank tried to restructure right around global practices and shifting sort of that balance, right, between country-focused operations and if you will, look towards more global challenges. And it reverted back to that. So there's a deeper and we know where also the power, if you will, lies within the bank and where the resources. So any comments deeply on what that means for the operational model of the bank, because there was resistance to that. And then broadly for all of you is we talk about this shift for addressing global challenges, and pandemics is mentioned, and appreciate Secretary Yellen and others who have done that. But when it comes to the solutions, the financing solutions, and every one of you did this as well, and it diverts back to climate, as if climate is the only thing we're solving for. So comments on that. I was struck by the visual in the atrium yesterday of all the issues before the annual meetings. Health doesn't even appear there, and COVID-19's in the corner. So it feels already that we're putting the issue of pandemics behind us. We know that all of these are integrated. So just some comments about how we're making sure the solutions are not just targeted to the climate crisis. Thanks.
Thanks, Carolyn. Okay, one more. Other questions or comments? Back. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Takashi Miyahara, the Executive Director at the World Bank representing Japan, and then the fellow of Monica and Michael here. So my question may be, directed to Monica, and then you made a very important point that the global public goods ambition needs to be aligned to national strategy or national development strategy. Yeah, true. Then here the issue is, how we can enable the dialogue. I mean, between in the bank's context, between the bank stream and then your country authority to make that happen. Meaning to to incorporate the global public goods agenda smoothly and rationally into the national development agenda, and what kind of the efforts or improvement could be possible in your idea, and then of course the other panelists as well, if possible.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. One more question here in the second row. Shabtai, right here.
Hi, Shabtai Gold with DevEx. I've been following this quite closely. And firstly, as a journalist, I'm happy this is happening in the open, so thank you for that. I just wanted to ask specifically, because when I speak with some ministers from low-income countries, there's a little bit of pushback on, there's a concern basically that if it's not country-led, who's leading that borrowing demand? So it would be, I know you touched on it, Assistant Secretary, in your opening remarks, but it would be interesting to hear a little bit more on that to make sure there is the buy-in that Ed's talking about, and that it's everyone's involved. Thank you.
Okay, well, one more question, because you're going to give me a little. I have someone showing me 5 minutes at the front. But.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Ute Kotsche. I'm with Urgewald from Germany, and I'm belonging to the civil society. And it's about ambitions. And of course, we know that in the countries, you need to discuss all these also with the groups on the ground, because they are the ones who know best what's happening there. And the problem is that often they don't have contact. They don't know what the country directors are doing, and sometimes the country's directors are not knowing what the headquarters are doing and saying. So there has to be a much more ambitious focus and how to relate to the people on the ground and to the groups who are willing to do something to fight global climate change, also all the poverty issues and all the needs. Also, we have to include more women. We know that our minister is doing a lot to include the feminist development. But my ask is, how do you include women in your ambition?
Okay, thank you. This panel is doing okay, at least. Okay, so we have a number of disparate questions, and we're almost to the end of time. So maybe we'll start with you, Jürgen, and we'll just go through, and we'll end with Alexia. So go ahead, Jürgen.
Yes, of course, one has to discuss with countries. The question is a little bit how to discuss with countries. And there is a difference. I'm exaggerating now, but just to make the point clear, if the bank or we are going to a country and say, oh, we have here a proposal, we could do this project, investment project. Or if you help countries to understand the magnitude of the challenges, for example, climate, and to provide high-level analytical expertise and to help countries in this decision-making, and then respond to countries in what they could do in order to make it happen. So that's another approach. And I just want to mention the famous JET piece, the Just Energy Transition programs. Yes. This is the kind of approach. Now the bank is on board. It was an initiative by some G7 countries. That's another type of dialogue. We are sitting together with the countries and the governments as equals. And we are discussing, we have a problem. So how shall we address that problem? How can we make the energy transition happen and just? And that's another type of conversation. And in this conversation, civil society come in, the people come in. In South Africa, for example, we have a consensus, we have a joint understanding with the South African government that in the process there is outreach to all the stakeholders. So that's another type to address problems, I think. And then, of course, it has to be just, and low-income countries, I think they are facing so many problems. We need additional resources, but you can't really play out, one thing against the other. So don't make a good thing because there is perhaps a risk or so. At least for the German government, I can say that we have that in mind. I mean, Africa, low-income countries, they are really in a desperate situation now, like also some middle-income countries with the debt. And with this discussion, we can't solve all the problems. But I just said we have a systematic view, not only looking at the World Bank, but also at the others. And we have other ideas and instruments we would like to offer in order to respond to this situation of low-income countries, for example. And the minister has mentioned the Global Shield, which is really looking systematically on what can we do with countries to protect the poor once the crisis hits, the climate crisis or the climate-related crisis, the biodiversity crisis. So to help countries in a systematic way to build up prevention, to build up pre-arranged financing instruments, that once the crisis hits, it becomes less costly and the countries can save their livelihoods.
Okay, good. Ed?
I've spoken too much already, so I'm going to try and be super concise. Absolutely agree. We need to keep our eyes on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. There's a new financial intermediary fund which has been set up. There's only a little bit of money, I agree, but the bank is also putting its own money into this, and I think the thinking is that the fifth will be something that can help to catalyze, but that we need to, of course, continue to focus on that. Please don't make us go through another reorganization of the World Bank. We've spent the last decade moving the deck chairs one way and the other. It's not the solution. The solution is strategic clarity and strong analytical work that we can use as a driver of dialogue and to shift our programming, and it will shift. It's shifting already with the CCDRs, and I think we can continue that momentum. And then I think on the issues about country-driven development versus global public goods, I mentioned in my first intervention, I think that this is a false dichotomy. Yes, we've got to be all the time listening to people on the ground, governments, stakeholders, women. We need to build ownership for things that our diagnostic work and our assessment are priorities for the country, and we need to win hearts and minds. We can't do it by forcing countries to do things that they don't want to do. I think it's important to remember we're a development institution, but we're also a bank. We can't sign the loan agreements for countries, and even if we could, it wouldn't result in development progress if there wasn't ownership. So building that ownership is what's key, I think, and not just trying to organize a different way or trying to take away the country-driven development model. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the questions. And I want to address Takashi's, my colleague from Japan, question about the global public good and how can we convince, how we work with the countries for them to demand and how to incorporate, for example, the climate issue. In the case in some countries in Latin America, the climate issue, because we don't feel the same problems in energy. For example, we have problems landslide, we have some droughts, we have some kind of problems, but it's important that the country understand that this is because of climate. So there's a problem to be solved there. Mm-hmm. So, but they are focused, for example, in have more water and sanitation, electricity access, internet access that are fundamental for the development goals. So if we go to the country and talk to them and explain, okay, you can do this project, but at the same time you are addressing the problems of climate, in the same project you can address both things. Mm-hmm. But we have to go to go to the field and understand what is the need. Sometimes, and I was at the other side of the table when I was working for the Ministry of Finance, and we're dealing with the World Bank about the project and about when you put the key indicators you need. And for the bank, maybe some indicators will be important, but for the country, they are not. So we have to listen carefully of the needs of that's what I said, the national priorities, and how can we move? And I'm glad to hear you that there's no contradiction between the global driven and the global challenge, but we have to understand and listen very carefully what the countries need and how we can manage within the projects and within the scope of the World Bank. And we are here, and as an emerging market, as a developing country, we have some goal. Our goal, and I think we share with all the countries, we need to foster our development. That's what those main concern. It has to be poverty for some others, maybe the distribution of income, but maybe education, health. But at the end, it's a development goal that we want to address. We want to move faster to growth. And if we don't have growth, we can't have anything of this. We can talk for hours about it, but I only want to say that the development banks at the World Bank has a key role with helping the countries to do this. And in some countries, the regional relation is very important. In the Middle East, for example, in the case of energy, we need a solution, a regional solution for that. So it's very important to look at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Alexia.
2 quick answers and 2 additional final points, if I may. So on the what's the agenda for global public goods? So the work that we've done to date, and those countries that have been most engaged on sort of defining this agenda, we've decided to focus on 3: climate, existential issue, pandemics, and fragility. So that's sort of the agenda, and then sort of with knowledge, the knowledge work of the World Bank and the other MDBs being sort of a cross-cutting, really fundamental public good as well. And just to give you 2 examples so that you know that there's specificity behind those words. One is in terms of the operational approach. One of the questions that we put on the table is, who can the bank lend to? And so, for example, should it be able to lend to supranationals? In the case of the pandemic, to COVAX, for example. And then just another one in terms of incentives is really calculating the positive and negative externalities, for example, of communicable diseases in country diagnostics, right? Because the diagnostics and the evidence drives a lot of the work of the banks. So that's to your very important question. And then I think in terms of where emerging markets are, where low-income countries are, I think the only way this will work is if we have a real coalition of shareholders, and the evolution has to work for all the shareholders. First and foremost, the borrowing shareholders, low-income and middle-income countries, but also for the donor countries. And we've had a great breakfast this morning that was about reaching out more to emerging markets. We need to continue to do that work. Frankly, sometimes it's hard because we want to talk to emerging markets from their experience. So, for example, on the incentive question, it'll be critical to do a listening tour, I think you said earlier this morning, Minister, to really hear what are the incentives that can make a difference. And then we also need borrowing countries to come with their experience as a client, but also as a shareholder. Which is sometimes hard to do, actually, from the attention span, right? So I think that's really a commitment of ours to continue to do this work. And then I think the Indians, with their upcoming G20 presidency, they have said that one of their priorities is MDB reform. And so really connecting with them and their agenda, I think, is a huge opportunity as well. So lots and lots of work to be done, but I'm optimistic. And then the 2 points, sorry, I know we're late, but I can't help myself, on private capital mobilization. So in some rooms like this, I think the conversations are, in my view, a very technical term, in la-la land, about the trillions of capital that are going to go straight to the toughest, trickiest issues in the toughest, trickiest countries. However, there is capital that can be mobilized for our needs, and it's not just about blending. Blending is a key part of it. But I would say most fundamentally, it is a cultural change, and I've worked for 2 MDBs, so I'm going to allow myself to say this. It's also about a cultural change within the MDBs, and it's normal. The MDBs were not created. They were created to be project financiers. So it's a different mindset to not just say, what can I put out, but how can I bring in something else? So we need to think about this in real ways, and then we need to think about, in addition to blended finance, different kinds of de-risking instruments, more use of guarantees, insurance, reinsurance. we need to think about, and you're doing this, right? But issuing bonds, green bonds, social bonds, risk sharing. So can we cycle off assets off the balance sheets of the MDBs when the risk return gets such that the private sector might come in? Tricky issue. What's a responsible exit? You know, so if it started as an MDB project, if we give it to the private sector, is there really no responsibility for the MDBs? Will the shareholders, will our political economies accept that? Question mark. But it's worth doing work on that. But I just don't want the answer be, hey, shareholders, can you give us donor funding, and then we'll mobilize private capital. So I think it's more than that. Sorry, Ed. Okay, and then final point is we focused on the MDBs, the details. I hope you got a sense that there's a detailed agenda behind this and that we still have to build with more shareholders. But I also want to remind ourselves that as central as the MDBs are to the United States, they're one part of the puzzle. And I think overburdening or over-expecting of what the MDBs will do on their own is also wrong. We also need to make sure that we have capital markets that function. We need to look at local, currency solutions. We need to move away all the investments that are fossil fuel investments, the $700 billion I was reading the other day in the International Energy Association that are right now fossil fuel investments. We need that to move into investing into the kinds of things that we care about, including clean energy. So there's that. When we talk about financing, we have to think about financing super broadly with the MDBs as a central key piece of the puzzle, but not the only piece of the puzzle.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we'll end there. I think that's an excellent call to arms. Very clear issues ahead and a lot of expectation for our dear colleagues at the World Bank. Wishing you lots of help and support. So thanks everyone for coming out on a Saturday.